The frost clung to the barbed wire like a line of tiny white claws. Dawn had not yet broken over the Carpathian foothills, and the world felt suspended between night and morning, caught in a silence so heavy it seemed to press against the eardrums. Captain Robert Caldwell of the Canadian Army stepped from the back of the transport truck and exhaled a plume of steam into the air. The men around him adjusted their rifles and stamped their feet against the cold. But Caldwell stood still, staring across the snow toward the cluster of ramshackle buildings just beyond the tree line. A Hungarian gendarme waited for them, shoulders hunched, cigarette glowing faintly in the dark. "You are late," the gendarme barked in broken English. "Commandant is not pleased." Caldwell did not answer immediately. He was listening to something faint behind the wind. At first he thought it might be the groaning of the wooden structures shifting in the cold. But then he heard it again, a thin whimper that rose and fell in desperate intervals. A child. He stepped forward, boots crunching on ice. "What is this place?" he asked. His voice carried the kind of calm that unnerved men who had something to hide. "Transit facility," the gendarme replied. "Only temporary. They will be moved east soon. You only inspect the rail lines and sign the papers." The whimper came again. Caldwell's jaw tightened. Days earlier, his unit had been assigned as part of a joint Canadian-British liaison team to oversee railway logistics in territory now under German influence. It was a bureaucratic task on paper. But Caldwell had suspected from the moment he saw the orders that something darker lay beneath the language of transport approvals and security inspections. Rumors had seeped through Allied intelligence channels for nearly a year. Stories of mass deportations and camps that did not appear on any official map. Senior officers dismissed most of it as exaggeration or propaganda. Caldwell did not. He followed the sound to a narrow shed. The door was held shut by a plank nailed across it horizontally. A thin hand slipped through the gap near the hinge, fingers trembling in the cold. Caldwell stepped closer and spoke gently. "Who is in there?" he asked. The hand withdrew instantly like a frightened animal retreating into a burrow. The gendarme snapped, "You are not authorized to open that. They are Jews awaiting relocation. Nothing to concern your command." Caldwell turned. "If they are civilians under your jurisdiction, they are under our protection as Allied representatives. Remove the plank." The Hungarian hesitated. Caldwell's sergeant, a broad-shouldered farm boy from Manitoba, shifted his rifle just enough to remind the man that Canadians were not easily dismissed. The gendarme spat into the snow and pried the plank loose. The door swung inward. The stench of sweat, sickness, and fear rolled out like a physical force. Inside, huddled in the dimness, were at least 30 people. Most were children. A few clutched faded blankets. Others had nothing but the clothes on their backs. A girl of maybe 10 years stared at Caldwell with hollow eyes that had forgotten what hope looked like. "How long have they been in here?" Caldwell asked. 2 days, the gendarme replied. "Food is limited. Transport will come. Not your business." Caldwell stepped inside, lowering himself to one knee beside the girl. "What is your name?" he asked. "Mira," she whispered. "Are you hungry, Mira?" She nodded. The motion seemed to drain the last of her strength. Caldwell rose slowly, controlled, as if balancing a weight he could not drop. He turned back to the Hungarian. "These people are freezing. They need food, warmth, medical attention. You will release them to my unit at once." "That is impossible," the gendarme snapped. "Orders come from Budapest. These Jews are to be transported to German custody. Interference is a crime." Caldwell stepped forward until he stood inches away from him. Then you can explain to Berlin why a Canadian officer discovered a facility violating every international convention your government claims to respect. My report will reach London by nightfall. Do you understand what that means for you?" The gendarme faltered. His cigarette trembled between his fingers. He muttered something under his breath and gestured to another guard, who hurried off toward the main building. Caldwell's sergeant approached. "Sir," he said quietly, "we can't take them all. We don't have the trucks or the clearance." Caldwell looked back at the shed. The children had begun whispering among themselves, watching the soldiers with a mixture of disbelief and terror. "We can't leave them here," he said. "Not after seeing this." The sergeant shifted uncomfortably. "What do you want us to do?" "We start with food and blankets. Then I wire headquarters. Someone higher up needs to hear what is going on in these hills." It took nearly an hour to coax the civilians into the open. The older ones helped the younger, their steps fragile as if the ground might suddenly give way. Several Canadian soldiers handed out ration biscuits, tearing their own portions in half when supplies ran low. A medic wrapped a boy's frostbitten fingers with cloth torn from his scarf. Caldwell supervised silently, hands clasped behind his back, his expression set like stone. When the Hungarian commandant finally arrived, his face was red with fury. "You have no right," he shouted. "These people are property of the state." "Human beings are not property," Caldwell replied. "You obstruct official transfer." "I prevent a crime." The commandant glared at him, breathing hard, calculating how far he could push before the situation spiraled into international incident. The Germans relied heavily on Hungarian cooperation. A scandal involving Allied officers could complicate everything. At last he gave a curt nod. "You may feed them," he said, "but they stay here. Transport is coming." Caldwell knew it was the best concession he would get today. But he also knew that once those trains departed, no one would ever see these people again. He needed something more than emergency rations. He needed a plan. That night, as his men set up camp beside the rail yard, Caldwell sat alone in the cab of an abandoned locomotive. Snow drifted through the broken window, melting on the warm metal near the boiler. He opened his notebook and wrote a single sentence. "No one in Ottawa or London will understand what is happening here unless I show them." He stared at the words for a long time. 30 children shivering in a shed had pushed him past the line most officers never crossed. There would be consequences. Perhaps court-martial, perhaps worse. But the image of Mira's eyes refused to leave him. Outside, the wind howled across the tracks. In the distance, an engine whistle echoed through the valley, signaling the approach of a German supply convoy. Caldwell closed his notebook and placed it inside his coat. If the world was blind to the truth, he would force it to look. And somewhere deep in that moment, the first spark of the crazy idea that would later save 34,000 lives began to form. The telegraph office smelled of coal dust and damp wool coats. Captain Robert Caldwell stood at the counter, tapping his gloved fingers against the wood as the operator connected the line. The man behind the machine kept glancing at him nervously. Canadian officers did not normally request priority transmission on Hungarian soil, especially not encrypted messages addressed to Allied High Command. Caldwell knew that every keystroke was being monitored. He also knew he had no choice. When the line clicked open, he dictated the report slowly, every word sharpened by the memory of the children in the shed. Urgent. Civilian transfers appear to be mass deportations. Conditions unsafe. Evidence of systemic maltreatment. Request immediate investigation. The operator hesitated before typing the final word. Caldwell leaned forward, voice low. "Finish it!" The message went out, swallowed by the winter air. Caldwell stepped outside into the early morning light. Frost coated the telephone wires like strands of crystal. His sergeant approached, carrying a stack of folded blankets. "Headquarters isn't going to like what you just sent," the sergeant said.
"They need to see the truth," Caldwell replied.
"Sir, you've poked a hornet's nest. The Germans will come asking questions. So will the Hungarians. They won't let this go." Caldwell glanced toward the rail yard. Mira stood with several children near a barrel fire, hands stretched toward the warmth. The sight hardened his resolve. Let them come. By midday, 2 German officers arrived in a staff car coated in road dust. They stepped out briskly, their coats immaculate, expressions cold enough to match the weather. The senior officer, Major Otto Kranz, approached with a rigid smile. "Captain Caldwell," he said in crisp English, "we hear there has been a misunderstanding." Caldwell folded his arms. "There is no misunderstanding. These civilians are being held in inhumane conditions." Kranz arched an eyebrow. "They are awaiting resettlement, a routine measure. The war has created shortages everywhere. You know this." "I know what I saw," Caldwell replied. Kranz's smile thinned. "We ask that you refrain from interfering. The political situation is delicate. Hungary is an ally of Germany. If your government wishes to maintain cooperation, it is wise not to overstep." The veiled threat hung in the air like smoke. Caldwell met the major's stare without blinking. "Their safety falls under the Geneva Convention. As long as my unit is responsible for this rail line, I will ensure that no one is mistreated." Kranz's jaw twitched. He recognized the tone of a man who would not bend. "Very well, Captain," he said. "But understand this. These relocations cannot be stopped. Not by you, not by Canada, not by anyone." He turned sharply and left without waiting for an answer. That night, the first draft of Caldwell's idea began to take shape. It came slowly, piece by piece. While he sat alone beside the rail yard lanterns, the tracks hummed with distant vibrations as freight cars rolled through the valley, carrying supplies to the Eastern Front. The Germans controlled every train on Hungarian soil, every schedule, every manifest, every departure. But Caldwell was part of the Allied liaison assigned to ensure efficiency on those same lines. It was a subtle but powerful position. For weeks he studied the ledgers. The more he read, the more horrifying the pattern became. Entire communities were vanishing into the east. No forwarding address, no civilian records, only lists marked with a single word: Umsiedlung, resettlement. The reports from Poland had whispered the truth in fragments. Now Caldwell saw it in the ink. One night, as he traced a pencil across the timetables, a thought struck him with such clarity he froze mid-breath. If they are moved by trains, then trains are the key. If trains can take them to danger, trains can take them away from it. The idea seemed impossible, absurd. A Canadian captain rerouting thousands of Hungarian Jews under the noses of the Germans. But impossible did not mean unworkable, not if one understood how bureaucracy moved. The next day, he brought the idea to his sergeant. "You want to hide civilians inside railway transports?" the sergeant said, eyes wide. "Sir, that is madness." "Not hide," Caldwell said. "Reclassify. Change their designations, move them under authorized categories." Authorized categories of what? Labor battalions, agricultural assignments, industrial workers? Germany is desperate for manpower. They have paperwork for everything. If we can create the illusion that these people are essential to railway operations, we can pull them away from the deportation lists. "That would require forging official documents," the sergeant said. "We won't forge anything," Caldwell replied. We issue real papers, with our signatures, under the authority of the Allied liaison. The sergeant gaped at him. We don't have that kind of authority. We have enough to cause confusion, enough to stall, enough to remove names from dangerous lists. All we need is time and the right paperwork. And the Germans will never question it. They question everything. But they cannot afford delays on the eastern supply lines. If we bury these civilians inside labor requisitions tied to railway logistics, the Germans will be forced to sort them manually. By the time they do, we will have moved them again. The sergeant sat heavily on a crate. You're talking about thousands of people. I am. And if this fails, we all hang. I know. Later that evening, the first test began. Caldwell approached the Hungarian commandant with a stack of requisition forms. These individuals are being reassigned, Caldwell said calmly. I require your signature. The commandant frowned at the papers. You want Jewish civilians placed on work orders for railway maintenance. Under the Emergency Manpower Directive, Caldwell said. Signed last month. You received a copy? The commandant hesitated. The directive did exist. Wartime strain had left every Hungarian institution short-staffed. Moving a few dozen people onto the labor rolls was not entirely unusual, although doing so under Allied supervision was another matter.
Why do you care about them? The commandant asked.
Caldwell did not hesitate. Because dead workers repair no tracks. Alive ones do. The commandant considered this, then begrudgingly signed. The first group of 38 was removed from the deportation list within an hour. Success emboldened Caldwell. Over the next 2 weeks, he and his sergeant built an entire shadow bureaucracy parallel to the German one. Civilians were transferred from deportation manifests to agricultural timetables, from agricultural timetables to factory requisitions, from factory requisitions to repair crews. Every move bought more time. Each document created another layer of confusion. Caldwell's unit moved families between rail stations at night, slipping them into abandoned farmhouses and remote villages that still resisted German control. Whispers spread among the Hungarian guards. Some began turning a blind eye. Others quietly helped, motivated by guilt or simple humanity. By the end of the month, Caldwell had saved more than 1,000 people. But Germany noticed. On a bitter morning in January, Major Krantz returned, his coat dusted with frost, his expression devoid of politeness. You have been altering transport records, Krantz said. Thousands of names, all mysteriously reassigned. I follow Allied protocol, Caldwell replied. Krantz slammed a folder onto the table. Do not insult me. You are interfering in German operations. Your operations violate international law. Krantz stepped closer. You are a single officer in a foreign land. What do you think you can accomplish? Caldwell held his ground. Enough. Krantz stared at him for a long moment, as if studying a man he could not quite understand. Finally he spoke. You are playing a dangerous game, Captain. One that will end badly. He turned and left, leaving the threat hanging in the cold air. Caldwell watched him go. He knew the next steps would be harder. He also knew something else. His crazy plan was working, and now it was too large for anyone to easily stop. But danger was closing in fast. German intelligence was beginning to piece together the fragments. One mistake could undo everything. One train, one list, one missing signature. Caldwell looked out at the snow-covered valley and understood that the real test was only beginning. The lives of thousands now depended on how far he was willing to go. The thaw came early that spring, turning the frozen fields of northern Hungary into rivers of mud. The sun melted hard lines of frost from the railway ties, and the smell of wet soil drifted over the valley. Captain Robert Caldwell stood on a ridge overlooking the junction at Vásárosnamény, the most important rail crossing east of Budapest. Freight cars creaked on distant sidings, and smoke curled upward from the boilers like dark pennants unfurling across the pale sky. The moment he had feared was approaching. The Germans were mobilizing for a full audit of every rail transfer in the region. For months, Caldwell's paper labyrinth had confused and stalled the deportation machine. Jews marked for transport to extermination camps found themselves reclassified as agricultural laborers, railway clerks, repair specialists, and industrial workers. Thousands had disappeared into the Hungarian countryside, sheltered by villages that had little love for German authority. Thousands more were now hidden inside official work battalions under Canadian supervision. The operation had grown beyond him. It was no longer a single officer's act of defiance. It had become a silent movement, spreading from station to station, carried by conductors, inspectors, and even sympathetic gendarmes who knew what would happen if the trains reached their real destinations. But success had drawn attention. Major Otto Krantz of the German command had returned twice in the past week, each visit more aggressive than the last. His most recent warning echoed in Caldwell's mind. Your network is unraveling. We will find every name you have removed, and when we do, the consequences will be severe. Caldwell understood what that meant. Arrest was only the beginning, yet he could not stop now. Too many lives hung in the balance. That afternoon, the sergeant hurried up the ridge, breathless. Sir, we received a copy of the German directive. They will begin the audit in 72 hours. Every line, every manifest. Caldwell absorbed the information silently. An audit meant disaster. Even a partial review would expose everything. The lists did not match. The numbers did not match. Thousands of missing names would be traced back to the Allied liaison. There was only one way left to save the people under his protection. He had to move them, all of them, at once. The sergeant stared at him as if reading the thought directly from his face. Sir, please tell me you are not planning what I think you are planning. Caldwell turned toward the junction. We redirect the trains. You mean the entire battalion network, the sergeant said. That is impossible. Not impossible, Caldwell replied. Only unprecedented. The plan was reckless. It required perfect timing and coordination across more than a dozen stations. It required Hungarian station masters to pretend they had received new orders. It required German inspectors to be delayed at key junctions. It required entire work crews to vanish into the countryside without leaving gaps in the rosters. It required an illusion so complete that by the time the Germans realized what had happened, the people they sought would be far beyond their reach. That night, Caldwell gathered the most trusted station masters, conductors, and gendarmes in a dimly lit storeroom behind the switching tower. Lantern light flickered across anxious faces. Outside, the rumble of distant artillery rolled over the hills. The Eastern Front was creeping closer. Caldwell addressed them quietly. In 3 days, the Germans will begin an audit. If they discover our transfers, they will send trains east immediately. No one will be spared. We have one chance to move these families to safety. We either do it together or not at all. A Hungarian foreman stepped forward. Where will you take them? To the Romanian border, Caldwell said. There are villages in the mountains still outside German control. The locals will hide them. From there, we can guide some into neutral territory. You are asking us to risk execution, the foreman said. I know what I am asking, Caldwell replied. Silence settled over the room. Then Mira's father, a thin man with sharp eyes who had once been a school teacher, spoke softly. "We will help." One by one, others nodded. The decision was made. The operation began at dawn. Under a veil of routine, Caldwell issued new railway orders stamped with Canadian oversight. Trains originally bound for German depots were reassigned to maintenance routes. Boxcars filled with work battalions were quietly attached to civilian transport lines. Station masters entered false delays into the schedules, forcing German inspectors to wait for non-existent freight. Hundreds of children and elderly civilians were smuggled into livestock wagons that had been scrubbed clean to avoid suspicion. Caldwell moved between stations on horseback, avoiding main roads. He oversaw every transfer personally, sometimes carrying children to the wagons himself. The sergeant coordinated the signals, tapping encrypted messages through the telegraph. Move at 0400. Hold at the junction. Wait for the western line to clear. By the second night, more than 10,000 people had been moved. By the third, nearly 20,000. The Germans began to panic. Kranz arrived at the junction with a squad of soldiers, barking orders and demanding explanations. But every station master presented documents that appeared legitimate. Every conductor swore they had followed protocol. Every ledger was filled with Caldwell's meticulous handwriting, matching signatures, matching seals, matching codes pulled from genuine German requisitions he had studied for months.
Where are the transports? Kranz demanded.
Delayed, Caldwell said calmly. The weather has damaged the outer line. We are rerouting as quickly as possible. Kranz glared at him, suspicion burning like fire. But he could not disprove anything without the full audit. And the audit was still a day away. That night, a convoy of 26 guarded trains rumbled through the darkness toward the Romanian frontier. The moon cast a pale glow across the valley as the wheels thundered over the tracks. Inside the wagons, families huddled together, too afraid to speak, too hopeful to breathe freely. Mira sat near the door, holding her brother's hand. She watched the mountains rise in the distance like a wall of shadows, protecting them from the world behind. At the final junction, Caldwell waited on horseback as the trains approached one by one. The engineers signaled quietly, tipping their caps in the cold wind. Caldwell raised his hand in acknowledgement, each passing train a victory purchased with risk he could never fully measure. As the last engine disappeared around the bend, the sergeant approached. "Sir, that is everyone. More than 34,000 by our count." Caldwell felt the weight of the words settle over him. 34,000 souls carried out of danger by a plan that should never have succeeded. A plan born in a freezing shed months earlier when a child whispered her name. But the moment of triumph did not last. Hoofbeats thundered against the frozen mud. Kranz emerged from the darkness with mounted troops, eyes blazing with fury. "You," Kranz shouted, "you think we do not see what you have done." Caldwell did not reach for his weapon. He sat tall in the saddle, coat flapping in the wind, as if daring the major to act. "You cannot stop them now," Caldwell said. Kranz stared at him, chest heaving, rage warring with the knowledge that he was too late. The trains were already deep in the mountains. The snow and terrain would slow any pursuit. And once they crossed into sympathetic territory, the Germans would have no authority to follow. Kranz lowered his gaze, defeated not by weapons, but by paperwork and timing, and the sheer audacity of a man who had refused to look away. Caldwell turned his horse toward the ridge, watching the final plume of smoke disappear beyond the horizon. 34,000 lives were safe. He had not saved the world, but he had saved a world for each of them. and history would remember the Canadian officer whose crazy idea had outpaced an empire and carried thousands from the shadow of extermination into the fragile light of freedom.